At night, the printing ink became thicker than blood. Sticky, smelling of metal and alcohol, it ate into the fingers of the adult craftsman, who habitually whispered the print run count through clenched teeth. On the stone slabs, prints of satires with absurdly stretched profiles and campaign signs dried, where defeat was hidden under heroic headlines. By morning, they would be taken out to the stalls, but boots crashed through the door. A raid, lamps under their noses, boxes on the floor. The guards stacked the sheets into sealed bundles, and the workshop fell silent, as if the air had been cut off. A male voice greets you and asks you to write in the comments where you are watching from, and whether you have encountered in your cities how the defense of morals turns into silence over drawings that laugh at the authorities. He says that your stories help to map out the pressure and the response, and wishes you calm attention and pleasant listening. The inspection began formally and quickly. An adult engraver was forced to sign a protocol for the seizure of indecent sheets, and an adult printer was forced to sign a receipt for the safekeeping of the clichés until the court's decision. The engravings rustled in the bags, taking with them not only satire, but also change and bread. The raid report looked like a cold card. The number of boards, the number of sheets, the number of knives and spatulas, the names of the paints. Not a word about the fact that at the center of these pictures was a mockery of the imperial body, not as a body, but as a symbol, a belly, a tired uniform, scars from campaigns, and the contours of defeats hidden in rebusses. In the note of the censor, adult and dry as parchment, indecency stood next to insult to greatness. In this combination, the main thing was lost: the laughter behind the easel, which made defeat bearable for those who paid poll taxes and buried their husbands. The engraver, a grown man with black palms, understood that the debate about morality was just a shield. He laid out before him a register of seizures for several weeks, written out in full, and compared them with the city's conversations about the latest military reports. On the day when people whispered in the markets about the loss of men and carts, people came in the morning with lamps and seals. Leaflets in which satire unraveled silent defeats were arrested as indecent. He noticed that all the protocols had the same rhythm: indecency, threat to morality, confiscation. None of them mentioned the word defeat, but in each leaflet that was taken away, the lines formed a map of recent misfortunes, and adult buyers smiled, not because they were looking for dirt, but because they found relief. Wet stones and empty frames remained in the workshop. The engraver reduced his profits and losses to a simple table: days without printing, hungry calculations, days with printing, sold-out bundles and quiet conversations in the back rooms of shops. He did not claim to be a saint and did not flaunt his freedom. He counted trips to court, payment for lawyers' papers, feeding workers who stared at empty shelves. A new line appeared in his expense records: attempt to prove that obscenity is not about bed, but about laughing at ridicule. He took a folder to the office with sheets that really did have more physical hints than words, and next to it, another set where the emperor's body became a symbol of a campaign that didn't end as promised. It wasn't a thaw, it was a counting. The investigation began where it usually ends, in the department where adult employees sorted anonymous denunciations. The engraver gained access to the accompanying papers attached to his case and saw that a significant portion of the denunciations came from the headquarters responsible for previewing the images. This was the first key to the breakthrough. The language of the complaints coincided with the language of official warnings, and the dates indicated by the words were close to the dates of reports of failures at the front. Where a newspaper column cautiously wrote about a difficult situation, the denunciation used the word indecent. Thus, the dirty word became a convenient hook for pulling cards out of the benches where defeat was not hidden, but signed with a hat, a saber, or a ridiculous support in a boot. He collected more than 20 engravings from different workshops, which were confiscated as unacceptable pictures, and wrote down the reasons. In some, the figure of the emperor was distorted only through irony. In others, through a hint that the censor read as a physical challenge. He noticed crossed-out places on the sheets stamped with the word morals, where the joke was not about the bed, but about the stairs on the map. To admit this aloud would be to admit that censorship protects not the bed, but the face of authority. He chose other words. His note to the court contained the phrase, "Indecent," is used as a conventional sign to catch political mockery. The note was dry and suitable for a folder where emotions are not tolerated. Facts in the left column, comparisons in the right. In the raid records, he singled out items that usually do not interest the guardians of morality. Stones with cartouches where campaign symbols were inserted, clichés with inscriptions about provisions, small wedges for remission. These details speak not of filth, but of politics. But they were removed along with the spicy sheets, as if the law had to erase the memory of defeat from the workshops, along with the clichés. The engraver added to the case the testimony of adult buyers, which made the main point. The sheets were bought for the sake of laughing at fear, not for the sake of excitement. This laughter healed the silence in which funeral letters were distributed. He did not seek pity in these notes. He exposed a connection. The word indecency works as a shield when people in uniform recognize the mockery in the drawing. The heads of the stamp departments acted predictably. The connection, indecency, zayard mockery, was beneficial to them because the law on morality existed, but the law prohibiting laughter was not recognized. The engraver, who had previously drawn other people's plots, learned to draw tables. The first column contained the religious arguments of the censors, who asked for the removal of items that caused harmful excitement. The second column contained the technical parameters of satire, where the emperor was the icon of the campaign. There was no blood, no cruelty, no intimacy. The third column contained a list of defeats that adults whispered about in lines at the bakery. The columns were held together by an invisible bracket, where the second column contains a map of failure. The first column contains the word indecent. He gave these sheets to a lawyer, an adult with a scar on his temple from previous cases, who said that the judge would need to take one more step. This step was unpleasant and dangerous. To prove that the initiators of the denunciations were not outraged parishioners or anonymous family men, but preliminary control officers, the engraver found identical errors in two denunciations. The rare surname of an old general was misspelled, and the numbers in the name of the regiment were mixed up. The same errors were found in the memo that was handed out to shop window supervisors on the eve of the raids. He attached a copy of the memo and a table of coincidences. The restraint of this paper was stronger than any satirical stance. The judge would see that the voice of the people spoke the language of the censorship state. Where indecency was supposed to protect morality, it protected the charter of silence. The risk of prison became palpable. In cases of morality, refusal to cooperate was punished with months in solitary confinement and confiscation of equipment. The engraver began to prepare his workshop for closure, and at the same time to collect a portfolio of evidence. He knew that the prosecution would try to show pornography and calculated everything that could be attributed to bodily coarseness. 2 lubocks with a naked allegory of Europe, 1 parodic supply emblem in which the bodily element was at the limit of decency, and 1 drawing with an emphasized mask on a helmet. He separated these sheets into a separate envelope and signed it. Controversial, but not equal. The main stack consisted of satires without any hints of betting, only heavy humor about marches and wet overcoats, about disheveled staff papers, about symbols where failures are compressed. His argument was simple. Censorship levels everything to the lie of morality. In the hall where the fate of the workshops was decided, everything was determined at the usual speed of the office. The adult clerks on duty did not like heated debates and respected neat folders. The engraver brought a neat folder and divided it so that the court would recognize itself. The section with pornography was small. The section with political satire was large. The section with coincidences of denunciations and memos was eloquent. It was not convictions that moved, but the weight of evidence. He did not ask for mercy. He asked to separate two categories: harmful incitement and permissible mockery. He understood in advance that the victory would be partial. Some of the sheets would be destroyed. Some would save the workshop and show that the indecent pictures were a mask for political control. At that time, the city was developing its own arithmetic. Fear of prison was combined with fatigue from nameless victory marches that brought neither bread nor color. In adult shops, mimicry flourished. People did not say anything unnecessary, but bought what made them laugh. The watchful eyes of the headquarters noticed this demand and covered it with morality. Thus, the myth of protecting morals swallowed up the real goal, to prevent mockery from becoming a collective habit. The engraver placed a sheet of paper with a short formula at the top. It was not the body that was forbidden, but the ability to laugh at the body of power as a map of defeats. It was easier for the court to accept this than to admit to a direct ban on laughter, and it found a foothold: to separate pornography from political satire. The next step was to maintain a balance where the workshop remained alive and the city was not completely mute. He gathered everything that could show the mechanism without unnecessary words in one portfolio and began with a chronology of raids. Week after week, written down in words, he compared the hours of seizures with city rumors about failures at the front. The result was a stubborn synchronicity. On the day when news of broken carts and wet greatcoats spread through the taverns, officials with lamps and seals appeared in the morning. On the day when the newspapers cautiously hinted at difficult terrain, by evening, stacks of satires were being carried away from the shops under the pretext of protecting morals. The engraver laid out this synchronicity in a table with 3 columns. In the first, the date and city theme. In the second, a dictionary of denunciations with the keywords indecent, offensive, exciting. In the third, a list of confiscated stones and cliches, among which symbols of campaigns, maps with funnel-shaped crossings, and funny marks on uniforms invariably appeared. The table did not scream. It breathed calmly, like a counter in the treasury. It was this kind of breathing that the court was accustomed to trusting. At the same time, he wrote down a list of moral phrases on a separate sheet. The same phrases were repeated in the denunciations and warnings, as if they had been printed from a template. Offense to decency through physical innuendo, provocative caricature, loss of shame. He attached copies of an internal memo for window display supervisors to these phrases, in which the same expressions were used to indicate items for priority removal. The coincidence in language did not seem accidental, especially when 2 denunciations lay nearby with identical spelling errors in the rare surname of a veteran and reversed digits in the shelf number. This is how the second twist unfolded. The voices of public outrage turned out to be an echo of the instructions from the preliminary control headquarters, and indecency was a universal hook that could be conveniently used to remove ridicule of the authorities from circulation. To prevent the court from jumping to conclusions, he added medical and everyday details to the case, carefully maintaining a sense of proportion. The prison medical records noted insomnia, tremors, and exacerbation of old work-related injuries among the adult detainees. The guard reports noted frostbitten fingers among the printers who stood in unheated corridors awaiting interrogation. and workshop records mentioned downtime, disrupted deliveries of paper and ink, and malnutrition among apprentices. These details did not concern the bed and did not arouse curiosity, but they showed the price of the moral campaign. The case was called the protection of decency, but in reality, it drove a wedge into the economy of the craft. He filed away a short report from the Guild of Image Sellers. After each high-profile raid, sales of religious and everyday pictures plummeted, as if fear had blocked any drawing, and the shops were kept afloat by old stocks. The main risk remained the same. Morality opened the doors to prison faster than any word of mockery. Therefore, the defense strategy required cold architecture. The first block consisted of truly controversial examples where allegory was on the verge of what was permissible. There were few of them. He acknowledged this in advance so as not to try to pass everything off as flawless. The second block was a massive stack of political satires without any physical allusions, where the humor was based on symbols of campaigns, signs of provisions, wet greatcoats, broken carts, and ridiculous poses on staff maps. The third was the similarities between the language of denunciations and the language of memos. The fourth was a chronology in which the raids coincided with days of bad news from the front. The fifth was economic and medical records as a backdrop of pressure. This composition allowed the court to draw a line without getting into discussions about taste. Pornography on one side, political satire on the other. While he was polishing the folder, secondary waves of pressure were sweeping through the city. The guards came not only to workshops, but also to shops, confiscating individual prints from merchants and threatening them with fines for stockpiling debauchery. The accompanying reports recorded the neat words, "without resistance," but between the lines, one could read the fatigue of adults living on the pittance of small trade. The engraver collected several trade books of the day, showing a drop in revenue, compared them with the dates of the raids, and placed them next to the guild letters, which asked for at least advance notice of inspections, so as not to leave people in debt in the middle of the week. There was also a list of ruined small workshops that did not survive the confiscation of their machines. They had no reserves and fell apart in silence while lofty words about propriety were being invented for the public. He understood that for a sustainable solution, it was necessary to show the court not only the harm, but also the alternative. Therefore, a small section appeared in the appendices, which is rarely found in such cases. Examples of satire, withdrawn from sale at the request of the censor, reworked by the author, and returned to circulation without any physical hint, but with the same political meaning. In one sheet, an allegorical figure with emphasized plasticity was replaced with a broken drum and a torn map. In another, with an empty standard above a bridge where carts had fallen through. The court, accustomed to the procedure, could rely on this precedent. If morals really protect decency, then after the revision there is no reason to ban them. If the ban remains, then the reason was not shame, but laughter at the authorities. Thus, the court found a way to divide the issue. Unexpectedly, the cautious arithmetic of another office, the Treasury, was layered on top of his. In one of the memoranda, cool and dispassionate, officials noted that a total purge of images would affect the tax on paper and ink, as well as the collection of guild stamps. This was not support for freedom. It was a reminder of revenue. He added these lines as an additional argument. To ban everything means to lose money, to allow some means to return turnover without crossing the boundaries of decency. Economics sometimes helped where words about principles slid down the wall. The question arose as to the identity of those who initiated the denunciations. It was dangerous to name the preliminary control headquarters directly, but he could continue with the method of comparison. He showed that the denunciations from different regions came in the same handwriting, smooth, with the same mistakes in rare names, that they referred to formulations unknown to the general public but present in internal memos, that the address for feedback coincided with the post office where the preliminary review files were kept. The court did not need a loud exposure. It was enough for the court to see that the civil unrest originated at the desk of a clerical clerk. Thus, the third twist, the origin of the denunciations, became tangible without the risk of turning the hearing into a pamphlet. Meanwhile, the engraver continued to be pinched from all sides. Apprentices scattered to other crafts. Letters were lost. Stones cracked from dampness. He recorded these losses in a ledger so as not to be left empty-handed if the court offered a half-hearted solution. His plan B was simple. Remove the main machine from harm's way, transfer part of the work to everyday images, and keep the reworked satires without controversial body symbols ready. He did not allow himself to lose completely, because behind him stood adult workers for whom this workshop was a fair payment for each print. Finally, the case came to a hearing where 5 of his blocks lay on the judge's table. He did not hear or speak loud words. He saw fingers turning pages, a pencil leaving thin strokes in the margins opposite the coincidences of language, his gaze lingering on the chronology of raids, where each seized day coincided with a dose of bad news. This bundle could not be untied by someone else's rhetoric. The court, without becoming the defender of laughter, became the defender of procedure. If everything that is mocking is removed from circulation under the guise of indecency, then tomorrow, political cartoons without a single controversial hint will also disappear. He felt how the balance on the scales ceased to be theater. The court announced the need to divide the sheets into 2 groups, controversial ones requiring removal, and satires that did not contain bodily references and were therefore permissible for circulation with the label political caricature. The decision did not undo past losses, but it closed the main loophole. The myth of protecting morals could no longer serve as a universal switchblade against ridicule. After the meeting, a strange calm descended on the city. The censors remained in their posts, but their vocabulary became more cumbersome. Now, every indecent image had to be accompanied by a clear analysis. The guilds breathed a sigh of relief because an appeal procedure for caricature cases had been introduced. The vice squad was forced to divide the sheets into bodily and political in their reports, which meant taking responsibility for the substitution. Newspapers, which had been cowardly silent just yesterday, ventured to print short notes about the court's distinction between genres. Workshops that had survived the winter of confiscations cautiously returned drums, torn maps, wet overcoats, and empty banners to their shop windows. For the first time in months, the engravers saw that the cash register contained not 0, but a modest balance. He knew that the machine would not stop and would find a new language tomorrow to hide its fear of laughter. But he had a piece of paper in his hands with the words, "Pornography cannot be covered up with imperial indignation, and mockery of defeat cannot be declared filth." He filed the decision with his tables, leaving space next to it for new raids and new tricks, because that's how history works. Prohibitions love to come back. And yet, on that day, he allowed himself a brief respite, not as a victor of freedom, but as a craftsman who had regained the right to honest work, where paint sticks to his fingers, not to forms of fear. The court's decision turned out to be the beginning of a new routine war over wording. The office demanded reports from the censors describing signs of bodily illusion, and the paper, which had previously been content with a loud word, suddenly became slow and detailed. The protocols began to include schematic outlines of figures, arrows pointing to items of clothing, lists of symbols of campaigns, lists of maps and broken banners. Where one word had previously sufficed, proof was now required, and every extra stroke risked being interpreted as an admission of the political purpose of the ban. This did not turn censorship into an ally, but it shifted the center of gravity. The universal dirty button no longer worked without difficulty. The engraver, who had survived the winter of seizures, kept 2 stacks on his table, approved satires and controversial sheets, and taught his apprentices the customs of the new caution. If the smile stays on the drum and the torn map, the sheet will make it to the counter. If the smiley face remained on the contours of the body, the sheet would go into the controversial box, where other risks lay. The word appeal appeared in the guild book with a note on the procedure. The master brings 2 copies, one stamped political caricature, the other marked for revision, with a list of elements that raise doubts. Behind this dry procedure lay a new system of checks and balances. The censor who signed off on the physical copy was responsible for the loss of tax coins from paper and ink, and the treasury was responsible for the resulting shortfall in revenue. The city shops, which until recently had been frozen at the sight of lamps and seals, began to live in short cycles. A week for cutting the cliché, a week for test prints, a week for cautious bargaining, a week for responses from the office. The engraver kept simple, military-style records. Days when the ink went to the cash register. Days when the ink soaked empty pallets under frozen machines. There were fewer adult printers detained pending investigation in the prison records. But the consequences of winter lingered in the medical notes for a long time. Tremors in people who had been waiting weeks for a call. Pain in the hands of engravers after downtime. Insomnia in salespeople who had seen their goods taken away before their eyes. The doctor's reports did not sound like political declarations, but they made visible what usually drowned in the noise. The guardians of decency, acting as a cover for administrative control, were stifling the breath of the crafts. Judges, reading such lines, did not become heroic defenders of satire, but they were more willing to agree to the division of genres and to a re-examination. In one of the cases that followed, the court required the censors to provide not only a verbal description of the indecency, but also a sketch in which the controversial element was separated from the political part. It seemed like a trifle, but this trifle turned morals from a club into a pencil that leaves a mark. A new, cautious reading culture emerged on the market. Adult buyers, taught by the winter panic, sought in satire not risk, but the key to experiencing the common shameful truth. Wet overcoats, empty carts, torn maps, incorrect reports. They bought not for the sake of secret carnality, but for the sake of a now permitted way of not going mad from the unsaid. Sellers, who during the long weeks of raids feared even everyday scenes, returned genre sheets to their shop windows. Crafts, holidays, boats on the canals, street misdemeanors without cruelty. And these rows, together with satire, pulled the shops out of the red. The guild clearly saw that every indecency during periods of defeat at the front cut into the paper industry's turnover, and now a different tune was heard in correspondence with the treasury. The division of genres brings in revenue. The administration did not like free speech, but it did like the coins it received, and this became a quiet source of support for the workshops. Meanwhile, the engraver returned to the source of the myth and the document so as not to lose the thread. He collected a block of clippings about protecting morals, which said that the city was being rid of lewd pictures, and placed next to it a block of official definitions of political caricature that the court had allowed to be used. The gap was clear. The myth still sold the story of saving morality, while the document offered instructions on how not to confuse laughter at the authorities with incitement. In cases that followed by inertia, there were still attempts to push through the old formula, but the judges, having once weighed the chronology of raids and frontline deferrals, became more cautious. One of the decisions, written without emotion, contained a phrase that was key to the craft. Indecency cannot serve as a universal label for prohibiting ridicule. The formula did not have an immediate impact, but it gave the guild a fragment of language that was convenient for defending not taste, but order. Internal regrouping began at the preliminary control headquarters. Some employees, accustomed to the universal word, began to fail on appeals and lose influence. Others, more cautious, took up methodological aids that suggested translating controversial sheets into safe symbols. These instructions did not admit guilt, but they did admit limitation. If a smirk could be transferred from the outline of the body to the drum and the card, the morals would have no complaints. The engraver smiled bitterly at this pedagogy, but he used it because it saved the machine. He understood that the threat of prison had not gone away, that any new failure at the front could bring back harsh orders, and so he kept double plots in reserve. One harsh sketch for the workshop wall, where adult workers gathered and discussed the news, and one reworked version for the counter, where the satire remained political rather than physical. A few months later, a new section appeared in the guild's summary records: Separation Practice. It simply recorded how many sheets had returned to circulation after editing, how many had been deemed dangerous under the old category, how many had gone to court, and how many had been returned on appeal. The statistics did not sound like a victory for freedom, but they served as a reminder that the procedure was capable of reining in the zoo of words. At the same time, the first proposals for resolutions on future checks were submitted to the office, to separate physical incitement from political mockery, to define the signs objectively, to require supporting sketches from the control authorities, and to introduce a label for satire that was acceptable in the absence of physical insinuation. These dry innovations were a continuation of the judicial line and the Treasury's caution. The city was slowly and awkwardly emerging from winter. Printing workers returned to their machines, some with tremors in their hands, and doctors observed this without drama, noting the restoration of sleep and weight. The shops began to rustle with paper again, and there was more life in this rustling than in speeches about propriety. Buyers learned to read laughter as they read a map, the survival rate for those who kept a lot inside themselves. The engraver, who had fewer clichés left than before the raids, nevertheless kept the main thread in mind. Censorship did not become sacred. It simply lost the right to hide behind a single word. This was the limit that could be achieved with craftsmanship and tables. By the end of this story, myth and document no longer stood on opposite sides. They were linked in a single line of the court's ruling. The protection of morals cannot replace control over laughter, and political caricature that does not violate the boundaries of decency remains permissible. There was no romance in this line, but it contained the most important thing: human decisions that were shaped by the engraver's fatigue, the lawyer's pedantry, the judge's caution, the Treasury's stingy memory, and the dry honesty of the medical report. Each made their small move, and the machine, accustomed to closing doors with a single word, rolled back a step. It will remain nearby tomorrow, but those who print laughter now have a tool to detain it. Not a cry or a slogan, but a folder with a chronology of raids, with coincidences of language, with sketches, with appeals, and with notes in the margins, where it is written in words, without numbers, for those who will come after. They banned not the body, they banned mockery. And it can be brought back if we divide the heat of myth and the cold of document and force them to meet where the court recognizes the difference. The judicial formula slowly seeped into life, but the machine did not give up. It changed its lexicon. Words such as public tranquility, class enmity, and threat to military discipline appeared in memos where the old nerve, the fear of ridicule, was carefully inserted. The engraver, who had survived the winter and spring, rebuilt the warehouse just in case. Clichés with symbols of bodies were now stored separately under rags, and clichés with drums, maps, empty standards, and wet greatcoats lay in the upper boxes. He continued to keep his 3-column chronicle. In the left column, new control words in the middle, edited sheets in the right, revenue and fines written out in words. This accounting prose conveyed the main point. When control hid behind sanctity, the shops died. When control was forced to explain itself, the shops lived and paid their fees. The guild, taught by bitter experience, drew up a small charter for caricatures, a memo explaining in simple rules how to transfer laughter from physical allusions to objects of the campaign, how to indicate defeat without exposing oneself, how to leave space in the frame for the reader, not the censor. In the fall, recorded in words, a new inspection took place, this time not at night, but during the day, with a polite knock on the door and a long inventory. Adult officials in clean gloves unfolded a long piece of paper on the table and methodically walked around the machines. They took several controversial clichés, including one old sheet with an allegory on the verge of what was permissible, and took them away for re-evaluation. In return, they left receipts, neatly numbered. This was not a mercy. It was a consequence of the very judicial formula that forced the institution to show its work in pencil rather than with a club. In the evening, the engraver gathered his apprentices and explained that the new speed was slower, but it gave them a chance to live until winter. He showed them maps of the rivers along which the convoys traveled, torn banners, dented barrels, objects from which they now had to construct humor. The apprentices, grown up and tired, nodded and learned to carve so that laughter touched on the military outcome, not someone else's skin. On the other side of town, the lawyer with the scar on his temple was preparing to publish a slim brochure on the separation of genres, not as a manifesto, but as a guide for shopkeepers and printers on how to handle appeals. He compiled short, unadorned cases. When the court allowed a sheet after replacing a figure with an object, when it demanded a sketch from the censor and found a substitution in it, when it rejected a complaint because the artist, contrary to warnings, continued to press on the bodily symbol. These notes did not burn like pamphlets, but were passed around like tools. The engraver, leafing through them on his knees at the machine, marked with a pencil the points that saved time. Prepare a clean version of the satire in advance. Keep a chronology of raids. Record handwriting and mistakes. Put all receipt numbers in a separate bag. Memory became a craft. Meanwhile, hospital records showed what was perhaps the first improvement in many months. Adult printers no longer had night terrors. Salespeople were able to sleep again, and engravers' fingers stopped trembling. Doctors explained this, not by the kindness of the authorities, but by the predictability of the procedure. There was no need to wait for a blow to fall if you could argue with a pencil. These dry lines, attached to one of the guild's complaints, added another, non-economic dimension to the engraver's argument. People get sick from the loss of ridicule, and they recover from the return of controlled ridicule. The court, having received these medical reports through its offices, did not proclaim freedom. It repeated its old words, but more emphatically and heavily: separate, explain, apply sketches. And this again forced control to shift from shouting to drawing. Winter brought a new challenge, not confiscation, but silence. The city ran out of good paper, and only rough, coarse paper that did not absorb ink well remained in stock. The guild wrote to the treasury that the shortfall in revenue from paper collection would not be due to caricatures, but to supply. The response was curt: find substitutes, take care of the clichés, limit print runs. For the engraver, this meant a loss of revenue and an increase in the temptation for censorship. Any shortage is convenient for strengthening the hand of others. He made a decision to transfer some of the satires to a smaller format to save space, simplify the forms without losing meaning, and preserve the contrast so that even on poor quality paper, the drum, map, overcoat, and empty standard would remain legible. He took the trial sheets to his friend's shop and saw adult customers carefully putting them in their pockets, not as a collection of indecencies, but as little talismans against lies. At that moment, he realized that he had persevered not for the sake of victory, but for the sake of rhythm. As long as harmless laughter continues in the city, it is still possible to talk about defeat without shouting and without confession. In the spring, written in words, the office tried to reclaim its space, this time through concerns about discipline. Caricatures, they said, were harmful to the spirit of the army. The engraver had his response ready in advance in a folder. He showed at the meeting that his sheets did not depict bloody scenes, did not humiliate soldiers, but struck at empty reports and staff self-confidence. That laughter was directed up the ladder of responsibility. That the targets of ridicule were cards of failure and torn banners, not the bodies of ordinary soldiers. He attached letters from adult military personnel, which cautiously stated that these sheets were read in the barracks as a relief after difficult news, that they did not disrupt order, but relieved tension. The court, without becoming a judge of spirits, recognized that discipline was not a universal anchor for prohibition. The formula of separating genres received another boost, distinguishing mockery of the administration from mockery of the service. This is how the general outcome, which is not like a triumph, came about. The workshop survived, but became simpler. Fewer sharp lines, more restrained signs. Censorship did not disappear, but lost the right to hide behind sanctity and discipline without explanation. The Guild learned to write appeals not to conscience, but to instructions, and the Treasury learned to calculate where verbal fervor turns into the coldness of fees. Medical notebooks did not glorify freedom, but recorded human measure. A predictable procedure heals better than fear. History did not offer miracles. It offered slow engineering work on words. The myth of protecting morals remained in brochures for the square, the document, in folders, where the pencil defeated the baton. The engraver, standing at the window between the machines, watched as adult buyers slowly dispersed across the wet pavement, hiding small formats under their coats. A drum, a map, an overcoat, an empty standard. This simple set contained everything he had endured the raids for. The right to laugh without debauchery, the right to remember without shouting, the right to craft without confessions of holiness. He did not consider himself a winner, and did not feel that he had saved the era. He simply preserved the language in which adults call defeat, defeat, and a ban on laughter, a ban on laughter, even if it was packaged in the word morals. And if tomorrow the lexicon of power changes again, he already has a folder with chronology, sketches, receipts, and medical certificates, a set that does not excite the crowd but convinces the court. This poor but honest technique is what keeps the air in the workshops, where paint is always thicker than blood at night, and in the morning there is enough of it again to keep people from being alone with their fear. By the summer, expressed in words, the city had become quieter, not because the dispute had disappeared, but because the dispute had taken shape. A new sign hung on the wall of the guild with a brief order. Before calling the guard, the censor must indicate the signs of bodily insinuation and attach a sketch. Before appealing, the master must present a second version of the sheet with the smile transferred to the symbols of the campaign. Before closing the shop, the official must leave numbered receipts. These rules did not eliminate the pressure, but they turned it into a path that could be followed and counted. The engraver, sitting down at his machine in the evening, laid out the chronology of the past months before him and saw in it the main, barely noticeable line: the myth of protecting morals ceased to be a nameless substitute for any prohibition. The document that the court had pushed into the light forced the machine to write in pencil. This meant that both craft and laughter had acquired the density of objects: a drum, a map, a wet overcoat, an empty standard, and no longer needed to whisper. But the machine did not abandon its habits. It found a new workaround through the word panic. The preliminary control notes stated, "Caricature undermines public tranquility, intensifying panic." The word was tempting. It did not require describing physicality, did not force one to draw a sketch of indecency, and promised a wide corridor. The engraver reacted with the first sheets of the new cycle. There, laughter shot higher than usual. He clenched his caricatured hand, not on physicality or on an ordinary person, but on the headquarters paper. Empty lines where "everything according to plan" was written with desperate effort, next to a wet boot print that slid right across the word "victory." At the bottom was a torn map turned upside down. Satire no longer needed characters. It had enough documents from the authorities themselves. The shops took the print run cautiously, and a week later, written in words, the censor brought a prescription with a new wording: "outrageous society." This word also had to be worked on with a pencil. He deployed the familiar three-column scheme in court. In the left column were recent denunciations with the words "panic" and "outrages." In the middle column were dates of bad news from the front. And in the right column were samples of cartoons that did not contain a single physical element, with the humor based on empty reports, overturned maps, and wet overcoats. He attached a couple of short notes from adult doctors, which mentioned violent bouts of anxiety during the weeks of silence rather than during the weeks of satire. Laughter, even bitter laughter, helped people stay upbeat, while empty news spread sticky fear. The court looked at this grid and asked for specifics. If there was panic, then describe what it was based on. In response, a terse document arrived in which an official acknowledged that sometimes public tranquility simply meant a ban on mocking the authorities. This letter cast a slight shadow on the previous court formula and thickened the part where it was necessary to distinguish between political caricature and incitement without relying on the body. At the same time, the Guild agreed with bookbinders and paper merchants on a simple way to deceive the deficit. Small format sheets were collected in book notebooks, as if the viewer were looking at a chronicle without authors' names. Inside were the same drums, maps, overcoats, and empty banners. The book form protected against sudden seizures because books were registered differently and required a different inventory procedure. The censors guessed, but ran into the same legal wall. To ban something, they needed evidence of physical harm or panic with justification. Thus, the craft did not win in heroism, but it did win in survivability. The engraver noted in the ledger how the cash register was changing. Instead of jumps, there was a slow curve. Instead of zero, there was a modest balance. Medical notes recorded something else. Adult printers no longer had ticks in their eyelids. Merchants no longer woke up at night, and the engraver's fingertips trembled less. Meanwhile, the myth persisted. The city newspapers were once again filled with moralistic headlines. The city is being cleansed of low laughter. The seals of debauchery have been reimposed. These phrases migrated from season to season because they were convenient. The engraver responded not with words, but with the blade of his chisel. He made a sheet without people, just an empty chair with a torn map spread out on it, a torn drum strap on the floor, a greatcoat thrown over the back of the chair, and a standard leaning against the wall without a pole. No hint of a body, only objects as a diagnosis. At the bottom, barely visible, was a note at the edge of the sheet. Laughter where there is no report. This sheet was bought less than the others, but it became useful in court. The censor had nothing to catch on to, and the judge had something to hold on to. In each such case, the fine line separating morals from mockery was reinforced. By the fall, again expressed in words, the office took a step that had previously seemed unthinkable. It issued brief instructions on political drawing, listing permissible symbols of military success: a map, a drum, a standard, a cart, a wagon train, a boot, and repeated the judicial formula: bodily references, grounds for prohibition, objective mockery, permissible in the absence of incitement. The instruction was born not out of a love of satire, but out of a desire to stop the flood of appeals and to more clearly delineate discipline. But for the engraver, it became a document that could be shown openly rather than whispered about. Symbols of defeat were allowed to construct language. This paper hung on the workshop stand next to the engraving blades, not as an icon, but as a tape measure. History, however, did not know any endings with ribbons. One evening, as he was closing the shutters, two adults in plain clothes approached the workshop. They presented a new type of order, on the harm to the reputation of the state. It contained neither morals, nor panic, nor bodily harm. It was a new circumvention. The engraver realized that the machine was learning. He opened a drawer and laid out 5 of his old tables, coincidences in the language of denunciations and memos, a chronology of raids and bad days at the front, censors' sketches where physical was absent, doctors' notes on the declining health of craftsmen during periods of silence, economic reports on the decline in revenue during periods of total prohibition. He did not prove anything with words. He showed how each new label turned into a pin on the same umbrella: control over ridicule. The men in plain clothes left, leaving behind an empty threat. In the morning, he filed another appeal, another neat folder. It was at this indifferent, paper-thin moment that it became clear how any honest story about censorship without sanctity ends. Not with escape or barricades, but with a habit of paperwork. The court, tired of the inventiveness of control, repeated the learned formula more and more often, and it slowly but surely crept into the instructions. The guild stopped writing impassioned petitions and learned to count. Which symbols pass, which fall, in which weeks the machines come out more often. Medical notebooks continued to record simple human affairs, where residents began to sleep better, where they stopped fighting each other in queues, where laughter returned without dirt. Newspapers, timidly finding words, began to print small jabs again, without names, without shouting, but with the right to smile at an empty report. The engraver did not believe in silence as a victory. He knew that tomorrow there would be new labels, new detours, and new pompous words. But he retained his professional clarity. The division of genres had become part of the language, and everyone who came to select the sheets would be obliged to draw their prohibition in pencil, rather than throwing the whip of common words. In the evening, he turned on the lamp by the stone, inhaled the thick smell of paint, and slowly ran the needle over the new cliché. There were no bodies and no heroes on it. There was a report board swollen with water, a map where the dotted lines had spread, and a drum that had burst at the seam. He knew that this sheet would make it to the display case. He knew that someone would buy it, not for the sake of secret thrills, but for the simple opportunity not to swallow lies. And he accepted this modest outcome as a human measure. Where myth says, "We protect morality," the document responds, "We do not hide laughter." And the craft, standing between them, chooses patient work so that tomorrow there will be enough strength to print what cannot be said otherwise.